Joining us now for this hour-long debate is Ben Peterson, Director and Founder of Journalists for Human Rights, Albert Berry, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Toronto, Rachel Mendelson, staff writer with Canadian Business, Barbara Heron, Professor of Social Work at York University, and Mernosh Pistonji, Director of Outreach at Crescent School here in Toronto. Hello to you all. Okay, so we're here to talk about voluntourism, and I'm not sure if the Oxford English Dictionary has yet accepted that as a proper English word, but that's what we're going with. Ben, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell me, what does the term voluntourism mean to you?
Well, as I was prepping for this, for today, I was talking to a lot of people about the term voluntourism, and everybody seemed to have a different sense of what it actually meant. For me, voluntourism is an opportunity that people pay for. So if you pay to go overseas for a trip and you get to do some volunteering activity at the same time, that to me is voluntourism. And most voluntourism opportunities are short term, for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, usually not more than a month or two.
Barbara, is that how you see it?
Yeah, and usually voluntourism does combine the volunteer work with some kind of tourism. So, and it's also work that is usually not very skilled intensive, because you're not going to stay that long. So there has to be a way that you can fit in and do something in your volunteer capacity that is of use to the project or to the organization.
What about the time frame that Ben mentions?
Yeah, that would be accurate.
So a few weeks after, what, 6 months, you're not considered a voluntourist anymore?
Maybe even after a couple of months, I think you might not be a voluntourist anymore.
Okay, well, you know, it's not a new phenomenon in Canada in the sense that since 1960, about 65,000 Canadians have gone overseas through this country's major volunteer organizations. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it is a growing trend. How has it changed in the past 40 years, Albert?
I haven't followed it closely enough, so probably somebody else will be able to give a better answer. But my impression is that 40 years ago, we didn't have nearly as many young tourists, or volunteers, if you like, and that and it wasn't as organized. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Rachel?
I would agree with that. I think what's happened recently, and this is something I think that Barbara mentioned to me when we spoke for the story that I wrote for Maclean's on the subject, people have done Europe, people have traveled around, and everyone's looking for more, and this has become a very popular more.
And people have done Miami Beach, the Miami Beach scene, and that's one of the this is an alternative, the alternative spring break. Instead of going down to Miami Beach for a couple weeks in March, maybe you're going off to Southern Africa for that. Why do you think there's been such a surge in terms of that, not only amongst young people like yourself, Rachel, but it is a growing trend for older people as well, Ben?
Well, I think people want to give back, and if they can go see the world and give back at the same time, they feel like they're having an adventure that is good for the world and also good for themselves. And we've seen an explosion in this voluntourism space. Like, companies are popping up every day that specialize in this. There was a study out recently in the US that said 1/4 of all Americans who travel are considering doing some sort of voluntourism type activity. We're at the very beginning of a huge growth industry.
Your organization, JHR, Journalists for Human Rights, sends professional journalists overseas. Do you consider that voluntourism?
No, I don't. What we do is not voluntourism, as far as I'm concerned.
Why not?
Because we send professional journalists who are paid over for 6 months at minimum. If we were doing shorter term placements where people paid us to facilitate their trip, that would be more voluntourism. And there's a number of organizations, though, that straddle this line quite finely.
I want to ask Rachel about that. Do you see Ben's organization as voluntourism? Because you wrote an article in Maclean's, which you mentioned, that talked about his organization. So do you see what he's doing as voluntourism?
I thought you might ask me that. And I mean, I actually don't, but if I could, I'd sort of like to get away from the term voluntourism a little bit, just because...
That's what the show's about. We're going to be in trouble.
Right. Just, I guess, in the context of, my thoughts, I guess, on Ben's organization, because I think that he does a lot of great work, and I think that his journalists do a lot of great work. But I do think that there are some elements of voluntourism, despite the fact that, that those journalists are being paid to share their expertise and to really, do some serious work and help a lot. There is some, element of an experience for them, a desire to, have a look at an authentic experience in a foreign country and do something that will really set them apart, perhaps a line to put on a resume. And those are I think, hallmarks of voluntourism as well. So I think it's a little bit more complicated.
Okay, Marinosh, no escaping this for you. Right. You send students as voluntourists to places like Nepal and India. They go for a couple of weeks, as I understand it?
Typically for a couple of weeks, 16 days or so. Okay. And again, the idea of volunteerism, I would like to think of it more of a service learning project. So in our case, we tend to focus on the service component of it, and we put a small segment of it, of tourism, within the realm of the 2 weeks that we're there. So the focus is on service. And I think an area where volunteerism, as you said, the trend within the last 40 years that's developing, and I'd say even in the last 10 years, there's a significant differentiation between facilitators that are for-profit and then facilitators that are for not-for-profit. And I think it's incumbent on the person providing this opportunity to research the facilitators. Because when it's for-profit, then there is a significant motivation change in either the service aspect of it or the business aspect of it. And with the trends that they're going, there's significant money to be made in the business aspect.
You're not sending young people to, sunny California or Paris. You're sending them to some pretty hard places in the world,
Absolutely.
India, Nepal, and exposing them to things that maybe they're not very familiar with in the Canadian context, like extreme poverty. What do you see as the benefits of having them to be exposed to such things?
I think, teaching at Crescent School, it's a school for independent, kids that are significantly wealthy. It's an independent school, and our mandate is to expose them to the world and give them a different perspective. So by exposing them to poverty, to also the commonality of humanity within the realm of the places we go. We went to Madagascar, we've gone to Nepal just recently, India, and so forth. What it does is broaden their horizons, and rather than seeing the world through the media and the internet, they have a better understanding of the world around them. And then the stereotypes and the unfortunate, the things that go along with stereotypes and media and so forth tend to get...
We're going to explore all those themes as we get through this, but I want to actually change gears a little bit, and I want to bring up a board. One of the criticisms of the phenomenon is the motivation of the volunteer, which many of you have already raised. Barbara, this is actually an excerpt from one of your research papers, so let's bring up that board. Here's what it says, well, at least part of it. There's a longing for a kind of authentic experience that is considered unavailable in Canada, and that derives from an exploration of what is seen as a kind of morally pure life being led by people whose cultural heritage appears to remain intact. Some describe this as an expression of consumerist approach in return for an investment of time and money. An authentic experience abroad can be, in a sense, purchased and then exchanged for a university course credit and/or enhancement on a resume back in Canada. Who wants to take a crack at this? Rich, what do you think about what Barbara's written?
I think that she more eloquently said what I was trying to get at a little bit earlier. I think that's quite right. And when you think about the motivations of young people, and I appreciate the point that you made about giving young people an experience to have for themselves. But I think that quite often the part that we don't talk about, and I think the part that needs to be added to the debate, is what the lasting effect is on those people who are providing that experience.
Marinosh, what do you make of what Barbara's written?
I think there's obviously, there's truth in it. However, I also feel that, as you've mentioned, there's an impact in the footprint that we leave behind. And it's in the approach and the planning of the trip itself that you take. And no doubt there is an impact and there is a footprint, and that's been going on for centuries. But how can we minimize that footprint? And by not just doing a one-off trip, I think you can minimize that footprint.
Barbara, it's your words, a consumerist approach. What's wrong with me as a university student going to spend a couple of weeks somewhere learning something and coming back and getting a university credit for that? What's wrong with that?
What's right with that? I guess would be my counter to that. There's many things that are problematic about it, and I think what Marinosh is saying about this kind of footprint that's left behind and that has been going on for centuries is one of the things that's problematic about it. And I think that there can be some learning experiences that are structured and that are constructive on both sides, but all too often that isn't the case, and the kind of preparation and I think the follow-up afterwards, which is really crucial, doesn't happen. So a consumerist approach means to me, means that you take what you can get out of it for yourself, and it becomes about what you've learned, what you get out of it, and how this looks on your resume, how this helps you to get through your university courses. And it isn't about giving back anymore. It isn't about the deeper levels of understanding. It becomes the kind of, as the quote says, like the search for the kind of authentic experience with a different culture. And often one of the hallmarks for our kind of eyes of what is an authentic experience is if people are poor. Because if they're poor, then they probably can't afford the kind of Western trappings, which makes people kind of the middle class folks, the professionally educated folks who often are exposed to a lot of Western education. They are not so authentic anymore in the eyes of the foreigners who are going to seek that authentic encounter.
Raj, do you agree with that? Because your students go to places where they may be searching, quote unquote, that authentic experience.
I don't completely agree with that, because we do prep our children that go there. They have an application process, they prep, and then we meet with them bi-weekly, and then we have a significant post-trip briefing. But at the same time, because we don't go to, for example, Tanzania, we've been going there for 6 years now. So we start building a relationship. It takes approximately about 3 years to build a trusting relationship with the partner organization. Now, once we do that, then we have a better understanding of their situation. And we don't go there with preconceived notions of doing a project there, like building a school, but because they don't need us to build a school. So we ask them what their needs are, and then we try and facilitate their needs if there are, or sometimes we're just there to work with, at the time, whatever the needs are at that time. So it's, I don't find it as a consumer thing, but there is an element of that.
Barbara, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
I think that what you're describing is, I would not have any concerns or major concerns about it. I mean, I think that what you've said speaks of a great deal of thoughtful engagement over time, taking direction from the local organizations or communities. And, but unfortunately that's quite rare. And when we talk of voluntourism, we're really talking of a huge phenomenon which I think has taken off really, as you said, in the last 10 years. And in the 90s, there was a shift towards short-term volunteering, which meant sort of 6 months, maybe 3. Now I'm involved in a research study with Rebecca Thiessen, and we've been having trouble finding people who have been overseas for going for the first time for 3 to 6 months. Most people have been already, and they've gone on these very short-term things. You go on the internet, you can just Google volunteer abroad or eye to eye. And there are so many opportunities. You choose the country, you choose the length of time. Do you want to have a vacation before or after? What kind of organization do you want? Do you want to be rural or urban? And I think for me, like the stereotypical thing is going and working with orphans or teaching English in an orphanage. And this is one of the most pernicious things I think that you can possibly do, frankly. And it is very consumerist.
Okay, you mentioned Rebecca Thiessen. We're actually going to talk about her a little bit, because you, Rachel, mentioned her in an article that you wrote for Maclean's back in 2008. Let's bring up that board and just go through it. So here's what was written by Rachel. No place carries more cultural capital than Africa, which holds so much mysticism, romanticism, and extreme poverty that for the most part, people don't even specify a country, says Queen's University professor Rebecca Thiessen. In fact, more young people go to Africa to lend a hand than anywhere else. But no matter how good their intentions, even before they step off the plane, this underlying quest for otherness denotes a kind of tourism, gazing upon those less often gazed. A notion, suspects Thiessen, that a lot of people would be uncomfortable with. Ben, your program, JHR, is exclusively, as I understand it, in Africa. What do you make of Rebecca Thiessen's observations?
I think it's a problem when you stereotype people's motivations for going to Africa, and I think it's a mistake to stereotype people's reactions once they get to Africa. we've sent hundreds and hundreds of people to Africa for long periods of time, and I've seen a whole variety of different motivations and reactions once they get onto the ground. I think the real key is, is not to look down at the people who want an experience that they can't get in their own country, but is to work as an organization to make sure that that experience is as positive and as responsible as possible.
Albert, what do you make of what Ben's, you're nodding your head, do you agree with him?
I agree with it, yes. I think it seems to me the several issues that probably define the better and the not so good experiences. One of them certainly is the length of time and the shortness of a lot of the voluntourism experiences raises questions. I think in general, going abroad, whether we call it voluntourism or whether we define it as having an element of consumerism or not, I think it has been a very positive influence on a lot of Canadians. And so to me, the issue is not whether it can or cannot, but under what conditions. And those conditions have to do with the duration of the experience, what the person's doing, and I think a lot with the preparation, monitoring after the event discussion, because I think those are one of the things you certainly don't want with a very significant share of the young people going abroad is an initial attitude of sort of superiority, whether we call it looking at poverty or what we call it is perhaps not central. And so I think it's important that the institution involved worry about that and make sure that there's not a naivety or something worse in the minds of too many of the students who go abroad. But that can be dealt with, I think.
How?
And so, well, I think adequate preparation, adequate discussion, adequate selection, which we do systematically with the university programs, but where it's a different challenge at the secondary level. I think a lot of the students are indeed self-selected for genuine interest, desire to help, things like that. And then I think what they need often is guidance on what does help mean and how do you avoid damaging some individuals, the culture, etc. And I guess the question that I perhaps know the least about voluntourism as a phenomenon here because I'm more involved with the university level. But my question really is, when are the students too young and when is it too short? And how can you counteract those potential problems?
How old are the boys that go over on your voluntourism projects?
The boys range from grade 9 to 18, but depending on the trip itself, they're selected based on grade and the cultural sensitivity and their experience, and depending on the country itself. For example, an example of India, for example, which is a tremendously, there's a huge, when you go there, I don't know if you get this influx of all sorts of components of culture that they have to be able to manage. And I think at certain age levels, they're too young to not only manage, but understand it. And so that's a significant area that we have to continue to work at.
Is 14 or 15 too young to be going to these? Because that's the ages you're sending over. Is that too young?
Well, for India, I would say unless they've already been there or they're from India or they've done some traveling in developing countries, I think 14 as a first trip is somewhat young. Because what they will gain, again, I don't want to just brush this as a full, because each individual is different. But at the same time, for the general populace, I think 14 is relatively young because what they gain out of the experience is not as critical.
Do you think age matters, Ben?
I think it does. I think that you need a certain level of maturity in order to A, fully appreciate the experience you're getting, and B, to exist within a cross-cultural environment in a responsible way. And I think it's age, and it's also the responsibility of the organization to select those people that are going to function well in a cross-cultural environment. I think that a lot of the problems that for-profit voluntourism organizations have is they'll just accept anybody who comes. Whereas a lot of the nonprofit organizations have the luxury of taking applications and selecting those people that they think are going to be best suited for that particular environment.
Rachel, you went somewhere as a volunteerist, did you not, some years ago?
Yeah.
Where did you go? And tell me about the experience.
Sure, yeah. In 2005, I was traveling for a few months in South America, and we decided to do a couple of weeks stint in an Amazonian village where we were to teach the children English, which, upon getting there, we immediately realized that this was primarily an experience for us. Needless to say, the children, their first language was Shuar, their second language was Spanish. They didn't really need to learn English. I mean, we had a good time, they had a good time. But it was certainly a voluntourism experience. I think it was $5 a day, so it wasn't thousands of dollars, which I know some people are shelling out. But it's certainly the emotions that I had and sort of the mixed reactions that I felt were sort of what inspired me to look into this further.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
Sure.
I'm not criticizing you of this, but critics of voluntourism say, young people often go and the motivation is to be virtuous, to make themselves, that it's the right thing and to feel good. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that gets right at the root of the issue here. An interesting thing I think for me was, upon speaking with a number of people who'd experienced similar, whether they'd gone for 2 weeks or 8 months, whether they'd been there for a few years, really doing solid development work. There is, there's always sort of a mix of emotions, and when you may have the most virtuous, seemingly altruistic motivations, there is some sort of cultural capital that's assigned to these experiences. And so, it is textured, and that was sort of what I was trying to, inject into the debate. I mean, I do think that it's important to realize that even the most altruistic motivations, there's often something else at play.
But I don't think that we should look down upon people that want an experience because they want to do good in this world. I think the key, though, is not to go into those situations, be naive about it, and go in with organizations and with help that can package your experience in a way that actually does really good things. Because as we've seen in a lot of cases, you brought up the orphanage example. I think that's a classic example where Westerners like to go in, they create very deep bonds in a short period of time with these children, and then they leave, and the hearts of these children are broken. And study after study have shown that that's actually a net negative experience for the orphans at hand. However, there's a lot of really great examples where voluntourism can actually lend a really helping hand to the local community. So it's all about, it's about wanting to do good, and we should harness that in people. But we need to control it and package it in ways that where that idealism is actually harnessed.
Let me pick up on that with you, Barbara, because there's a part of me that says, people are just perhaps wanting to go out and help, which is the argument that Ben's making. So what's the problem if people just want to go out and help?
Well, there's an assumption that our being there does help. And I honestly think that if we want to contribute, there are other ways of contributing. There are organizations that do really solid long-term development work, and we could give that money that we're spending on our having this experience and give it to an organization that will do the work on the long term with the community on the ground and be there. What happens when you have a village or villages, and increasingly these are remote areas that are getting targeted for the short-term voluntourism because they're safer. The big cities tend not to be quite as safe in many of the developing countries, for want of another word, due to the impact of almost 30 years of structural adjustment and the transformation of economies. So you have extremes of wealth and the most people being very, very poor with a kind of an emerging middle class. So it makes it for city environments to be quite unsafe. And increasingly now you find organizations sending volunteers for short periods of time to small communities, remote communities. So people now have these foreigners in their lives all the time. My question is, why? Would we do that here? Would we welcome those people coming here? We have the world in Canada. Most of the volunteers in the study that Rebecca and I have been doing, and in my own personal experience after many years working with CUSO and doing work in this area, most of them do not have relationships with those communities in Canada, before or after. They're not interested in those cultures when they're here. They want to go there and have the encounter there. And to me, that reveals something that's quite problematic about what is behind this, because you were talking about motivation and wanting to help. We want to help, but who does that person have to be for us to want to help them?
I heard you say, Ben, murmur. He said, we do that here. We do bring people over.
We bring people here all the time. And part of the beauty of this city and the country that we live in is that we're surrounded by people of all sorts of different cultures.
I think our point is we're not bringing them here for 2 weeks.
We're not bringing them. Some of them come here for 2 weeks, and that's fine with me. If they want to come here for 2 weeks, if they want to come here for a year, I think that our society benefits from having a multicultural outlook, and I think oftentimes, this is the same all around the world. And I think that, oftentimes, the host organizations that are on the ground in developing countries are the ones that are inviting people from Canada or elsewhere to come in and spend time with them. They're inviting them because you would think that they want them there. So obviously there is some need or some desire for Canadians over there. What?
They want them there. Okay, how is that want constructed? Like we did in the research that we did in 7 different countries. Peru, Guatemala, Jamaica, South Africa, Malawi, Zambia, and India. Or do organizations really want these people, or do they just feel they have to have them? It isn't clear to me that they necessarily want them, but this is how the aid package comes now. And if you have the foreigners, you get more money. If you don't have the foreigners, you have a problem because you don't have that kind of visibility. And there are ways in which having the foreigners also helps your work. I'm not saying it doesn't, but saying communities don't often feel they have a choice.
I think there often is like this reverse ethnocentricity when we look at a community and they want us there, but we say actually, well, maybe they don't want us there. I think that we often have to listen to our local partners on the ground when they're asking for assistance. They know best what they want, what they don't want, better than we can. If we want to, we can depackage their asks and all the rest. But at the end of the day, I think that if they want us there, and there's a need, then we should be providing our services. However, these partnerships need to be built in a responsible way. I'm not arguing against that for a second. Responsible partnerships, and I think one of the emerging best practices in the ecotourism or the voluntourism world is local ownership over these projects. If you get if the organizations that are hosting people actually have a stake in the company or in the organization and sit on the board and have an ownership stake, then you start getting real partnerships that is of real benefit to the local people.
Well, I want to talk more about the communities, the receivers of the end of these volunteers. Barbara, you make the argument that maybe the payoff isn't that great for them. What do you think, Albert? I mean, what do you think the benefits are for the communities that are having people come in and quote unquote help them?
Well, it's for me, it's tough to judge because I think the range of experiences is very great, and that partly reflects the seriousness of the organizations that send and the partner organizations. Do they identify accurately the needs of a lot of people? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So I think there's a lot of possibilities for success and a lot of possibilities for failure. One of the questions I asked myself is, what do the volunteer people wind up primarily doing, and do I, as an economist, think that this is likely to contribute significantly to the community, to the nation? And how well has that been thought about in advance? Because I find it fairly hard to think about. That is, we've realized over the years that some of the things that we as foreigners thought were important turned out not to be,
like what?
And vice versa. For example, free trade, important to some countries, but not probably not beneficial to others. So the picture on a lot of things like that is mixed and depends very much on the country conditions. But at the other end of the spectrum, certain health interventions, for example, extremely productive because local populations tend not to know what the problem is. And so I ask myself sometimes, well, where can a young person who hasn't had 40 years of experience in a niche area, in what area might they be able to say something or do something that the locals can't do? And in a lot of areas they can't because they just don't have the information. But I think there are a few areas where they can. And so one of my questions is, well, how well are those identified by any of the partners that are involved?
I think one area that I wanted to get back to what Rebecca was talking about is when the kids go there, you're planting a seed, and very often we don't know what is going to come out of that in the next 5-10 years. And very often when they end up going to university, their career paths or their paths of study change based on certain experiences that they might have had. And just off the top of my head, I can think of a couple of examples where just recently a student came back, had been on a trip to Madagascar and Tanzania, and changed his path to studying human rights, and did an intern for a year-long intern in Ghana for the Human Rights Commission. So each person has their own motivation initially, but then once they experience it, and that motivation, if it's nurtured properly, then it can really pay dividends in the future.
Yeah, and for me, I graduated from university. I had a passing interest in international affairs, and I ended up quite randomly getting a job in Ghana, and I worked there for 6 months, and it gave me an enormous amount of passion for human rights in Africa, and then I ended up starting Journalists for Human Rights, and 9 years later, we've trained over 8,000 African journalists how to report on human rights and good governance issues more effectively. I think there's a real value in instilling internationalism and a sense of giving back amongst young people in this country. There's no doubt about it. But again, it goes to what activities people end up doing when they're on the ground. And for me, good volunteering work internationally is equivalent to good development work. If you're adding capacity as opposed to taking capacity away, you are adding value. A big problem, I think, is when the typical example is kids go overseas to build schools. And while it's nice to have schools, oftentimes they're taking jobs away from local people who would be paid to build those schools. Instead, I think it would be more valuable for students to go over and work with the school boards, adding value to the entire system, or adding value to different elements within the country that they might not have the local expertise to do.
If I could just add one thing. I mean, I agree with the fact that there's value in an experience, and especially if you can inspire a young person to devote their lives to human rights issues, development, whatever that is. I think I would just argue that, we call these experiences then what they are. I mean, these are experiences. And, I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think that, part of the reason why we have this issue of are these consumerist experiences, how much cultural capital does this carry? It's because when you come home from these experiences and you put that line on your resume, your parents are bragging about you to their friends. You go to a job interview and people's eyes light up when you say you spent some time in Africa. I think that, as a society as a whole, if we can at least, start to maybe reframe some of the way that we think of these experiences and to call them what they are, call a spade, and then I think that some of the cultural capital will melt away, and maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Barbara, you study this. I mean, you're interviewing people who have been on the ground and come back, and people and the receiving end, the communities that have been there. What are you hearing from people in those communities? What are they saying are the benefits to them when people come over?
Well, we're not interviewing the community as such. We're interviewing staff and organizations, local organizations that work with communities, and the staff are saying that it gives the organization some prestige that they have foreigners. It makes them more visible to donors, and they rely on donors for money, and that the communities often enjoy having their very own foreigner for a period of time. They've seen them on TV, and now they have one that they can bring home and they can talk to and who wants to spend time with them. And they kind of seem like they enjoy it. Quite a few people say they felt that it kind of broadened the horizons of the local people. So, I think, I don't know if you consider that to be like a great benefit, but I suppose there's some kind of exchange going on.
Because in your book, you argue that it's more of a burden for the staff, the organizations on the ground. That
there is for the organizations who host people coming for especially we talked about the 2 to 4 month period, right? If it would be 5 or 6 months, okay, out of 140 interviews in these 7 different countries of staff and local NGOs, like local people, I think there was one organization that only does short term. It does the people coming for 2 to 3 months. That's what they do. They said, oh, if we had a choice between short term and long term, we would take short term. Everybody else said we would prefer that they come for a year or 2 years, but minimum 6 months, minimum. And the reason have to do with the burden on the organization. Right? They have these folks come, they talk about people coming with sort of overpacked agendas and high expectations that they're going to be able to get things done, that the organization will use its meager resources to facilitate their needs. And also because of safety issues that the caring for these folks never stops. You can't just, like, 5 o'clock comes and everybody goes home. You can't just let them go home. How are they going to get home, right? You have to take them home. You have to make sure that they know where to buy food and that they're safe. And if they're going to do something social, they want to go and drink in the local bar, that they don't go to the worst bar in town, that they know which is the safer bar for them, and that how are they going to get home after that? What will they do on the weekend? What do you do with them when they get sick? And people say, everybody says they get sick. They always get sick. They drink the food, they eat the food, they drink the water, something, but they're just not accustomed. They get malaria, right? They always get sick. So you have all this care for them that is even beyond the working hours. So it's a lot for small organizations that don't have adequate resources to cope with. And we also, I think, have to bear in mind that in many countries, staff working in these organizations, even at the level of program coordinators, are not that well paid. They may be going home to do a secondary job. And now they have, they're not able to put as much of their time and energy into their own work as they might like to, because they have to think about how they're going to get money outside of work hours. And now when they are at work, they've got these young foreigners that they have to manage all the time. So I think if you think of the context as well, right, you realize why it does become a burden. And not to speak of language, because unless you're in a country where people speak English, most of us, unless we're from Quebec, who speak French, right, or French and English, we don't speak, as you're saying, right, going to the Amazon, you don't speak the local language, and your Spanish might be pretty poor.
I want to get Myrnash and then Ben to hop in on this one, because your students are only going for a couple of weeks.
Absolutely, and that is a consideration that we do, Barbara's absolutely right on that, the load that it takes in hosting our kids. And so what we try to do, at least in our situation, what we try to do is make sure the load is not transferred over to the organization that we're going to. So if we go to help this organization, and that's why sometimes the prices of these trips can go up, because we take care of our own kids, so we will stay outside of the responsibility of that host, because their mandate or their responsibility is to take care of, may it be street children or whatever it might be, but that's their focus. We shouldn't be going in there and taking their focus away. So we try to manage that by either staying outside in our own area, own facilities, and making sure that we don't impact that host. But sometimes it's not possible, so that is a reality.
I think Barbara's perspective is quite useful, because on the con side of this debate, because look, this voluntourism is not going away. There's a huge market for it, it's only increasing. But we can use the work of Barbara and others who see the problems of it to make the sector better and stronger and more sustainable. And right now, I know Planeterra, which is the charitable arm of Gap Adventures, a local Toronto-based global adventure eco-tourism organization, is working with a number of other organizations on a set of best practices for voluntourism. And I think that these sorts of processes could be useful moving forward.
Okay, one of the other things, oh, let's let you hop in here, Albert.
Yeah, I have a sort of a general question I'd like to pose of everybody.
I'm asking the questions.
Oh,
no,
you're
I'm
sorry about
kidding.
that. Sorry about that. Well, I teach, you see. I'm always asking questions.
Go ahead.
No, so it seems to me we're in an area where unquestionably there are some experiences which are good. I'm certainly a fan of the idea of giving young Canadians the experience, to the international experience, the cultural experience, and so on. I think that's important and essential. At the same time, we've clearly got a lot of experiences at the other end of this spectrum where you can't say much positive about them, perhaps not even for the Canadians, although that I wouldn't have a feel on. But what worries me is kind of the big picture. If we are in the process of flooding, I was going to say flooding the market, but that's not the right metaphor here, but flooding the scenario. I think there's a difference sometimes between a few people and a lot of people, and it makes the difference between pushing those local partners over the limit and so on. And so the ultimate worry to me is, are we going to wind up with a lot of the actors following best practice, or are we going to wind up with profit maximization guaranteeing kind of the opposite? As long as there's money to be made, doesn't matter what else happens, you're not even going to understand it because you're not really interested in that. So your institution is guaranteed to run a lot of risks. And if we flood the world with that sort of voluntourism, then we're going to be pretty close to the end of the spectrum, the negative end. So who's going to step in and impose some guidelines, limits, regulations? That's my question.
But I think that the type of people that are doing voluntourism, as opposed to just tourism, are a little bit aware of the impact that they're making. And I think that if there can be greater standards and greater awareness about, and more transparency about the organizations doing good volunteerism as opposed to bad volunteerism, the market might work itself out a little bit in that respect. We're not talking about just not everybody's interested in this voluntourism business.
Yeah, well, I guess I have a metaphor in mind, which is bad firms drive out good firms in a lot of markets where there isn't good regulation. So will this be one of them? You can have 95% of the actors want to do the right thing, but if it's cheaper and more profitable to do the wrong thing, that 5% multiplies. And so I guess the ultimate question here is, if we don't have any way of controlling through governmental action, something like that, will the reputational effects be enough? Will enough of the actors feel forced or feel induced to act in a really responsible way? And can they do so within the limited information they have?
Just going to give Rachel a chance to get in here.
Right, yeah, I share your concern, certainly. And I think one of the unfortunate things is that, the organizations that have the power to enforce some regulation, I would argue that, Ben, your organization is one of those. You screen your candidates. But, as some undesirable candidates do slip through the cracks. And if that's happening, in an organization like yours, which, does apply really stringent screening techniques, I shudder to think about what's happening when all you have to do is like Barbara said, like you'd order a book on Amazon, just click through, your desired characteristics of your experience and hit pay. And I really think that is a cause for concern.
The goal in all of this, I think we can all agree on, is to create, maybe we can't agree on it, to create global citizens. That's the aim, anyway, of most of these voluntourist experiences. But again, I come back to, some of them are 2 weeks long. The maximum is maybe 6 months. And Murdoch, let me ask you this. How do you accomplish that feat of creating an enlightened global citizens in 2 weeks? Or is that an unrealistic expectation?
I think that is. To be realistically, in 2 weeks, we're not going to change the world. But at the same time, we are going to expose that individual or the student to a component of the world that otherwise they may not have had. But at the same, if we continue to go to that same organization over and over for a 10-year span, then the 2 weeks starts adding up, and the balance starts to get closer. It'll never be it'll never be balanced. We will always get the greater benefit, I think. But at the same time, the balance of reciprocity and the balance of a sustainable relationship that we can manage starts getting a little closer as we spend more time with the organizations.
But if it's unbalanced, is it ethical?
And that's, I think, again, you have to screen that, and we have to be very careful. And I think just to give you an example, I field about 2 to 3 phone calls, cold calls a week from facilitators trying to go on these trips. And my first question is, are you not for profit or are you a profit? And if they're for profit, I say, I'm sorry, but we won't be working with you. There are also incredible amounts of terminology that's out there now that makes it sound like it's a good thing, which I think, and students and people that haven't researched it make it sound, they get trapped in that. So one term that I always am bombarded with is social entrepreneurship. It's, it makes it sound really nice, but it's still, they're making a big profit margin on something that is not supposed to be. And
Barbara, is this ethical?
I don't think it's, okay, I don't want to say across the board is never ever ethical, because I think what Myrnash is describing is actually ethical. I think it's a long-term process. There are partnerships, and the same thing with your work, Ben. I mean, you're talking about partnerships over time, and you're talking about very young people, really, and preparing them over a period of time. And the short period that they have in another country is one of the building blocks out of many building blocks. It's not the one and only. But in the way that voluntourism happens, is it ethical? I would have to say no. I think it is consumerist. I think it can't help but, for most people, cannot help but to reaffirm stereotypes they already had, because they're not there long enough. And also, I think something we haven't talked about, which would be interesting to hear what you have to say about, but the social network concept, It used to be, back in the day, that you went somewhere and it was very far to go and you didn't know anybody else who ever went somewhere like that, and you wrote these long letters home and they took 2 weeks to get there, and then 2 weeks later, if you're lucky, the letters were crossing, right? But you might wait a month to hear back, and then you take pictures, and maybe you wait till you got home and get them developed and show them to everybody. So contrast that with today, where internet cafes are all over the show. Young people are going and getting on their laptops, or they may not be using their cell phones so much because of the cost. They're Skyping. They're uploading their photographs at the end of every day. They have never left home. During the day, they're in whichever the country is. At night, they go and they reprocess all of this in terms of their frame of reference, which is supported through their social network. So what is the possibility for this really creating these global citizens, unless it's part of a much longer term process, right? And you've got folks going for 6 months. So again, to me, that's different. It's come to the point that 6 months seems like really long to people. And at least, according to the folks that we've been interviewing, 6 months is a long enough time to start to let go, to start to really be in the country, to start to accept things on the terms that people see things on within the country, right? It is enough to start to really make that transition and to actually make some really valuable contributions.
Rachel, is it ethical? Do you think it's ethical?
I think I'm on the fence. I think our motivations are ethical, and I think that we'd like to believe that we are, but maybe that is part of the problem. I just think it's important to kind of ask ourselves that before we undertake any of these experiences, before we allow our children to undertake any of these experiences, before we pay for our children to undertake these experiences. I think, people really need to sit down, in the case of your students, sit down with your kids, and have these conversations about whether they think it's ethical. The idea that you can sort of add up the stamps in your passport and then that creates a global citizen, I do have a problem with that. And that concept, I think, is flawed. But I think that there are a lot of, it's sort of an open question, and I think one that the more you get people who are going on these experiences to try and answer that, the closer we are to having an ethical experience.
Ben, how do we make more people like you who go overseas, get some experience, come back and fight for social justice and human rights? So where do we go from here?
Well, I think we work as an industry, not that I'm part of the voluntourism industry, but that industry should work to develop guidelines across the board to standardize their work in such a way to make it as ethical as possible. I think there's some key elements that need to be built into most voluntourism work. One needs local ownership or partnership that is in-depth and long-lasting. Two, you need to train extensively the people that you're going to send over before they leave. Three, you need to screen applicants and weed out the bad apples. Four, you need to train them again once they get on the ground, because there's a whole other set of learning that happens before they start their volunteering. And then five, they need reinforcement and help when they're on the ground. Just don't send them overseas, but have a team of people working with them on a daily basis once they're on the ground. And then lastly, you need a feedback loop. So you need to be able to understand their experiences, pros and cons, and then constantly change your programs to make them better.
Mrnosh, 2 weeks. Yeah. It's a lot to do in 2 weeks, yes. What Ben's proposing.
I think that's a question that's always going to be, it is always on my mind. After each trip, after we get the feedback, as what he's talking about, the feedback loop, is to question your motives again. And I question them all the time of myself and the trip leaders and so forth. Why are we going there? So we have a selection process, we have everything in place, but at the same time, there are, as you said, there are people that want to go there to get stamps on their things, on their passports. Now, another component of it that I wanted to just talk about briefly is the idea that when students go over there and then they engage in something and then they come back, now they're going to be working in whatever field that they are. I'm hoping the ethics come out in their decision-making process because of some of the experiences that they have had. May it be in banking, may it be in law, or whatever sector. It is that idea with that concept, and it's going to work sometimes, and sometimes it's not going to work. But it's a balancing act again. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you. Mrnosh Pastanji is the Director of Outreach at Crescent School here in Toronto. Ben Peterson, Director and Founder of Journalists for Human Rights, and Rachel Mendelson, Staff Writer with Canadian Business, Albert Berry, Professor Emeritus of Economics at U of T, and Barbara Heron, Professor of Social Work at York University. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.